Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to episode number 89 of International Relations This Week. Under this series, every Wednesday at 8 p.m., we cover important geopolitical developments that affect India's national interests. The discussion will be strictly from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services examination. So if you're liking the initiative, do let us know by sharing your comments below once the stream ends. Do like the video, share it with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's start today's discussion by first taking a look at the topics that we are going to discuss today. We're going to cover 5 important developments, starting with the decision of OPEC plus countries to cut oil production. It's a very big development. We're going to cover that in complete detail. We shall talk about the UN peacekeeping forces and the rising fatalities being faced by the UN peacekeeping forces. We shall discuss how does this issue affect India. Then we'll talk about a disaster that happened in Africa, in West Africa, in a country known as Gambia. A number of children have been killed as a result of a cough syrup which was exported from India. So this disaster, this tragedy in Africa has implications for India's relations with African countries. So we'll examine this topic in complete detail. Then last week, the Nobel Prizes were announced, and we'll specifically look at the Nobel Peace Prize. Look at the Nobel laureates who were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize and the reason why the Nobel Committee has chosen this particular individual and these organizations and why they have been awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. And finally, we'll talk about a few latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. There have been some major developments, including the explosion of a strategic bridge that connects the Crimean Peninsula. This marks a key milestone in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and it does have implications for India. So we're going to cover these 5 topics in complete detail, and let's start with OPEC Plus and its decision to cut oil production. Last week, OPEC Plus countries have announced that they're going to reduce their oil production by 2 million barrels per day from next month. This marks a very significant development as far as the global oil markets are concerned. And the decision has been taken to increase oil prices and to protect the profitability of the oil exporting nations. So to understand this topic in detail, first we need to understand what is OPEC, what is OPEC Plus, and what's the reason behind this decision to cut oil production. See, the price cut which has been announced and the cut in supplies and production which has been announced, this happens to be the biggest production cut that OPEC Plus countries have announced since 2020. 2 years back when the pandemic broke out, the global economy was delivered a big shock because most countries went into a lockdown. They shut down their economies to contain the spread of the virus. So as the demand for oil went down, to deal with this new economic situation, OPEC Plus countries had back then reduced oil production by a massive 10 million barrels per day. This was the last biggest reduction in oil production and supplies. And OPEC Plus had taken the decision to ensure that the oil markets were stabilized following the sudden disruption which was caused by the pandemic. But as economy started recovering in the last 1.5 to 2 years, oil production was again increased. And since then, the policy of the OPEC countries was to keep increasing oil production. So in the last 2 years, this happens to be the biggest reversal in their policy. After the last reduction they did in 2020 to deal with the pandemic situation, following that, this happens to be the biggest reversal in their policy, and they've announced another major oil reduction that is up to 2 million barrels per day. So this will definitely hit the oil markets, the oil prices. So we need to examine what is the role of OPEC, what is the role of OPEC Plus countries in controlling the oil markets. How does this impact oil prices? How does this impact geopolitics? And how does this affect Indian interests? So first, let's begin the discussion by understanding what is OPEC and what is OPEC Plus. This factual understanding is very important, especially for your prelims. OPEC, it essentially functions like a cartel which determines the production and supply of oil. Thereby, it manages the supply-demand equation and determines the prices of oil in the global oil markets. It's a cartel-like group or cartel-like organization that is determining oil production and oil exports. It places a certain cap on oil production, fixes a certain quota for the member countries of OPEC with regard to their oil output. So by controlling production and supplies, it manages the supply-demand equation, thereby fixing oil prices. So as you can imagine, these countries who are members of OPEC and OPEC Plus, they are without a doubt very powerful countries in the global economy and also in global geopolitics. Because oil is the driver of the global economy. So by determining production and thereby determining the price of oil, the OPEC group and OPEC Plus, they play a disproportionate role in global economy and also in global geopolitics. This organization, that is Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, it was formed back in the year 1960. It was established through the Baghdad Conference by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. These were the founding members of OPEC. It's an intergovernmental organization. The governments of these countries, which are major oil producers and oil exporting nations, they formed this grouping called OPEC through the Baghdad Conference. Over the last 5 to 6 decades, OPEC has played a pivotal role in controlling oil markets and in determining oil prices. In 1970s, for example, the global economy was hit by a shock due to crisis in the oil markets. Then, OPEC countries played a key role in stabilizing the markets and in fixing prices which would help the oil exporting nations. Their main objective is to sustain production levels at an ideal level so that they can protect their profit margins, which is absolutely critical for their economies, because all these oil exporting nations, they are dependent heavily on their oil exports. So by controlling oil prices through oil production, they protect their profits, thereby protecting their economic interests. And this has very serious geopolitical implications as well. So over the years, OPEC has become stronger and powerful day by day. More oil exporting nations have joined the group as well. Initially, for 5 years, it was headquartered in Switzerland. Later, the headquarters was shifted to Vienna, Austria. So here, the OPEC members, they meet regularly. They usually meet every quarter, sometimes every month as well. And they determine their production levels. They fix production quotas for every member country. They stick to the production levels so that they can determine oil prices. These countries, which are members of OPEC, there are 13 countries in total. We'll take a look at the members as well. These 13 countries, which you see here, they account for 30% of the global crude oil production. So basically, they have a defining role in controlling the oil markets. So over the years, many countries have joined the group. Some have joined and left as well. For example, recently Qatar, Ecuador, even Indonesia, they were all members of OPEC, but they quit the organization. So as of today, according to OPEC's official website, there are 13 members left in the grouping. That includes Algeria, Angola, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, UAE and Venezuela. These are the major oil exporting nations. Most of them are Middle East countries, some of them are African nations as well, and you also have few Latin American countries. These are the major oil producing and exporting nations, and they have formed this organization which functions. Amongst the members, Saudi Arabia is the leading power of OPEC. It is the top oil producer within the group. As you can see in the graph here, Saudi Arabia happens to be the top producer and it plays a lead role in the decisions taken by the OPEC. Some of the decisions are economic in nature, but many decisions are inspired by geopolitical developments as well. So this makes Saudi Arabia very powerful in controlling and determining the oil markets. Followed by Saudi Arabia, we have Iraq, UAE, which are the other two top oil exporting nations. This cartel or this organization has three primary objectives. One is to coordinate and unify the petroleum policies amongst the member countries so that they can secure fair and stable prices for petroleum producers. The first objective, as you can see, it is meant to protect the interest of the producing nations, the exporting nations. The second objective is to ensure an efficient, economic and regular supply of petroleum to the consuming nations. The second priority is to ensure that oil supplies are stable so that the consumer nations are not affected by any disruption. And the third objective is to ensure that there is a fair return on capital. Essentially, the profit margins are protected for those who are investing in the industry. This refers to government investments and as well as private investments. So this cartel-like organization has been fixing the oil production levels for every member country, and it thereby fixes the oil prices. Hence, it functions like a cartel. Recently, the group was expanded to form OPEC Plus, which brings together 10 non-OPEC countries. There are few other petroleum producing nations and exporting nations which are close allies of the OPEC members. So they have come together. These non-OPEC countries also have come together to form a much larger organization, that is OPEC Plus. So the non-OPEC nations along with the 13 OPEC members, they have formed OPEC Plus, which also brings Russia into the grouping. Russia is a non-OPEC country, but Russia works closely with the OPEC through OPEC Plus, and Russia and Saudi Arabia are two dominant powers in this cartel, because even Russia is a major oil producing nation and a major exporter of oil and gas. This enlarged organization called OPEC Plus, which is a larger grouping of OPEC, was formed in 2016 when oil prices had crashed to a low point. So to bring up the oil prices again, 10 other allies of these countries, which are also major oil exporting nations, they came together to form the OPEC Plus, which today essentially consists of 23 nations. These 10 non-OPEC countries include Russia, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Brunei, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Mexico, Oman, South Sudan and Sudan. The members of OPEC and OPEC Plus can be important for your prelims. So today, OPEC and OPEC Plus are playing a key role in determining the oil prices. These 23 countries, they control 40% of the global oil production. So you can understand the significance of the group. They have a disproportionate control over the market, and when they decide to increase production or decrease production, it directly affects the oil prices. Now this leads to an issue for other countries, especially the oil importing nations like India, China, and even the US to an extent. Because the oil prices play a role in defining geopolitics as well. It affects American interests. So many countries, they often have issues in the way in which OPEC and OPEC Plus countries take decisions. So last week, when OPEC Plus announced a major reduction in oil production, it was immediately criticized by the US and many other countries because they are opposed to these changes. It affects their geopolitical interests. So first, let's understand why have they decided to cut oil production. Because cutting production by 2 million barrels per day is a significant drop in production. It will definitely increase oil prices because the demand sustains at the same level, but supply will go down in the coming weeks, and this will naturally push up oil prices. So it's important to understand why these countries have taken a decision to increase oil prices by cutting down on oil production. Now, if you look at the graph that I have shared here, it depicts the Brent crude oil futures price over the last few months. At the start of the year, when Russia invaded Ukraine, when the war broke out, it led to panic and chaos in the global markets, and there was a sudden surge in demand for oil, and the prices shot up to a high of $127 per barrel. It kept hovering at higher levels between $100 to $120 for the next few months. Even as recently as June, in the month of June, oil was priced at $120 per barrel as per the Brent crude oil future prices. But in the last 1.5 to 2 months, there has been a sudden decline in oil prices, and today oil prices have fallen to the range of $80 to $90 per barrel. This low oil price obviously will affect the profit margins of the exporting nations. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Russia, they're all concerned about the drop in oil prices. So to protect their profits, now they have decided to scale down production, to reduce oil production so that it leads to a crunch in the oil market, thereby increasing oil prices. The primary trigger is believed to be the global economic recession that is reportedly underway. I'm sure you would have read that the global economy is facing the prospect of a recession, that we are staring at a major economic slowdown. Especially in Europe, the fears of recession have gone up. Economies are stagnating. In the United States, interest rates have gone up and inflation is at a very high level. So the US is likely to increase interest rates further, thereby slowing down growth. Along with this, the oil demand from China especially has gone down in the last few weeks due to fresh lockdown measures that China has introduced to combat the pandemic. These global factors, these global economic factors, they had led to a drop in demand, and as a result the prices had fallen. Hence the OPEC plus nations are acting. They are trying to bring down the production now so that the prices can shoot up again, and they want to bring it back to the range of $100 to $120 per barrel. So this is the primary reason why OPEC plus countries have taken a call to cut oil production, primarily to protect their profits and to ensure that oil prices remain high. But Western governments, Western strategic experts, they all believe that there could possibly be a Russia angle behind this decision. Since Russia is a key member of OPEC plus, and since it shares good relations with Saudi Arabia, there is a possibility that the two might have colluded to deliberately push up oil prices as part of Russia's geopolitical rivalry with the Western countries. As you know, the Western countries and Russia are in the middle of a major standoff. Since several years, there is a new Cold War going on between Russia and the West. US and West European nations have repeatedly targeted Russia with economic sanctions. Ever since Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, Russia has been hit with economic sanctions. Particularly after the recent invasion of Russia, after Russia invaded Ukraine and the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out, Western countries have stepped up their sanctions to punish Russia economically for its military aggression. So potentially Russia might be trying to counter the Western countries by putting economic pressure on them by increasing oil prices. Because see, European countries, that is West European nations, they are very dependent on Russian oil and gas, especially during the winter season, which is coming up. European nations, they depend heavily on Russian oil and gas for heating purposes. And currently, European nations are looking to reduce their dependency on Russia. They are working with US to push Europe away from their dependency on Russian oil and gas. During the same time, if oil gas prices were to shoot up, if it becomes very expensive, then European nations may not be able to move away from their Russian dependency. It will secure revenue for Russia while giving Russia a geopolitical leverage as well over the European nations which have sided with US. So many experts, they are believing that there could be a potential involvement of Russia where the decision is largely geopolitical, it's not based on just the economic factors. So as a result, the United States has strongly opposed the decision. It has criticized OPEC and OPEC Plus for acting against the interests of the consumer, because this will definitely lead to an increase in oil prices and it will lead to broader inflation across markets. US President Joe Biden has been very critical of Saudi Arabia and even Russia, and US has made it clear that it opposes the production cuts that have been announced by OPEC plus. Now see, for US, there are other interests at play as well. Currently, President Biden has very low approval ratings in the US. In a few weeks, midterm elections are supposed to be held in the US, and Joe Biden has a very low approval rating. In this context, US is facing high inflation levels, and the elections are not likely to go in favor of President Biden. So since few months, US has been pressurizing Saudi Arabia to keep oil prices low so that it doesn't affect the inflation levels in US, which in turn could affect the electoral prospects of the Democrat Party. So there could be this angle as well, where Russia could possibly be working with Saudi Arabia to put pressure on the US government, which has been targeting Russia with economic sanctions. Even though US and Saudi Arabia have been close allies, of late differences have come up between them, especially between the Biden administration and the Saudi government. This might have pushed Saudi Arabia to work with Russia to push up oil prices that will lead to more inflation in US, which will affect the electoral prospects of the Democrat Party. That's why US is very upset about the decision, because rising inflation is not good for the current administration in the US. Is that clear? Whereas Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has retaliated against these comments. Saudi Arabia has rejected these allegations. It has said this is purely an economic decision taken by OPEC and OPEC plus countries just to stabilize the oil markets. Saudi Arabia has criticized US and Western countries for being driven by their wealth arrogance while criticizing the group. This is actually a part of a long-term conflict or a rivalry that's going on between US and the OPEC group. US has always been against the power exercised by the OPEC group, because as I mentioned earlier, OPEC has a disproportionate control over the oil markets, and the US has always been resisting that. In fact, the US Congress is reportedly working on a law as well, on a bill to prevent the cartelization of oil markets. This proposed law by the US Congress will directly hit groups like OPEC, which determine oil prices. So there is a history of rivalry between US and OPEC as well. So US has strongly opposed the decision to cut the production levels, because this will impact oil prices. So to counter the rise in prices, US has directed its Department of Energy to release 10 million barrels from its strategic petroleum reserve so that it can increase the supply in the market, thereby help stabilize the prices. Stabilize the prices by countering the production cuts of OPEC plus countries. So the US has announced a release of 10 million barrels of crude oil from its strategic petroleum reserves. It is also trying to work with other like-minded countries. It is also working with the US Congress to see how it can counter the dominance of OPEC and OPEC plus in the global oil market. As I mentioned, there is a proposed law by the US Congress which targets the cartelization of oil markets. And parallelly, US is working with countries like India, UK, China, Japan and South Korea. And most likely all these countries will coordinate and release more oil from their strategic reserves so that they can counter the production cuts by increasing supplies. India also has a strategic petroleum reserve project, just like US, UK and China and Japan and South Korea. India has built large underground storage facilities at Visakhapatnam in Andhra Pradesh, at Mangalore in Karnataka, also at Padur near Udupi, again in Karnataka. This is phase 1 of India's strategic petroleum reserve project, the Indian Strategic Petroleum Reserve Project. Through these underground storage facilities, we have built a stockpile of oil to deal with such shock events. We are extending this project to second phase as well. Under phase 2, many more such underground storage facilities are coming up, which gives India a cushion or a buffer or basically a stockpile to deal with such external shocks. So India has announced recently that it will be releasing 5 million barrels of oil from its strategic reserves by coordinating with other countries that includes US, UK, China, Japan and South Korea. because these big powers will be affected by the production cuts, by the oil prices which are going to rise. So to counter the OPEC and the OPEC plus countries, these countries which are affected by the decision, they are looking to release more oil from their strategic reserves to balance out the supply demand equation. So as you can see, the economic decision or the policy decision of OPEC plus has very serious geopolitical implications. India stands to get affected by this because our import bill will shoot up, and this will put pressure on our deficit, on our balance of payments and current account deficit. So India would obviously like to work with US, UK or China even if required to stabilize the prices and to ensure that oil prices are kept within a range that wouldn't affect the Indian national interests. So that is why the topic is very, very relevant and very important for both prelims and also for your mains. Now, let's move to the next topic, where we will talk about UN peacekeeping forces. This topic was in news last week because the chief of UN peacekeeping forces, Under Secretary General Jean-Pierre Laurix, he visited India last week. He interacted closely with the Indian government on India's contribution to the UN peacekeeping missions. So in this context, the topic becomes very relevant for our exams. See, India is one of the largest troop contributing countries to the UN peacekeeping forces. From the Indian Armed Forces, the Army, Navy and Air Force, and also from our paramilitary forces like BSF, ITBP and even other armed police organizations. India regularly contributes troops, thousands of troops, to UN peacekeeping missions around the world. Since India is one of the largest troop contributing countries, India has a lot of interest in ensuring the safety of our soldiers who are deployed abroad in conflict zones as part of these UN peacekeeping missions. The UN peacekeeping forces that you see in the image here, they're also referred to as the blue helmets because they wear the blue helmet that you see in the image with the UN logo. They operate under the UN Charter and their mandate is to maintain peace in a conflict-hit area. They're deployed in countries where there is a civil war going on, where a major conflict has broken out. So in such conflict zones, UN blue helmets are deployed under the UN flag, and this peacekeeping force is made up of troops from contributing countries. From many countries, many UN members, they contribute their troops to be a part of these peacekeeping missions. Because one of the key objectives of the UN, one of the primary objectives of UN is to maintain international peace and stability. So to ensure this, UN peacekeeping forces are deployed in certain conflict-hit countries. Of late, there is increasing concern regarding the rising fatalities amongst UN peacekeeping forces. Especially in the last 1.5 to 2 years, there have been an increasing number of attacks against UN peacekeeping forces and a number of UN peacekeepers have been killed in operation. Number of Indian soldiers also have lost their lives recently as well. So it's in this context that the Under Secretary General of UN peacekeeping forces paid a visit to India. During the visit, he brought up the issue of increasing fatalities amongst the UN peacekeepers, the risks, the threats that they are facing, and how India and other countries can help UN to combat the threats. So in this context, first we should understand India's contribution to UN peacekeeping. Because see, just a few months back, India lost 2 soldiers who were part of BSF, 2 BSF Jawans, who were deployed in Democratic Republic of Congo or DRC in Africa. They were killed in a direct attack carried out by the rebels because DRC is going through a civil war. The rebels targeted the UN peacekeeping forces and 2 Indian peacekeepers who were from the BSF, they lost their lives. This was a major development that happened a few weeks back. India's foreign minister had even tweeted about this. So in this context, we should learn more about India's contribution to UN peacekeeping. Since India is a responsible member of the UN, and since we are committed to the UN Charter, we have consistently tried to uphold the UN principles and objectives. So to bring peace and stability to the world, we have contributed troops over the decades, and India happens to be one of the largest troop contributing countries. In the last 60-70 years, we have contributed a total of 260,000 troops to UN peacekeeping missions. This makes India the largest troop contributing country. Usually, it's the developing and underdeveloped nations which contribute more troops to UN peacekeeping missions. The large developed nations in the P5 countries, the 5 permanent members, they largely stay away. Whereas developing underdeveloped nations who like to raise their global profile, who like to play a bigger role in the global geopolitics, they try to contribute more troops. So there is a big mismatch that you see when it comes to the contribution of troops made by developed and developing nations. India has a history of contributing troops, that too in large numbers. In total, we have contributed 260,000 troops, and India has lost 179 soldiers in the past. Till date, we have lost 179 soldiers, and this is the biggest fatality rate for any country. This is the highest fatality suffered by any troop contributing nation. So without a doubt, India has made an immense contribution for UN peacekeeping missions. If you look at the current situation, there are 12 UN peacekeeping missions going on around the world. Out of these 12 missions, in 9 missions, Indian soldiers are involved, and we have around 5,700 Indian soldiers in active duty as part of UN peacekeeping missions. You can see the graph here that depicts the current troop contribution. Currently, Bangladesh is the highest troop contributor as of now, followed by Nepal, then by India, and few other developing, underdeveloped nations. So India has always remained one of the largest troop contributing nations, but the concern we have is that troop contributing countries have no say or no power, no control in determining or in influencing the decisions of UN peacekeeping missions. This is one big concern that we have since many, many years. Even though we have been the largest troop contributing nation, even though hundreds of Indian soldiers have sacrificed their lives for UN missions, we still don't have any role or any authority to decide how the UN peacekeeping forces will be deployed, what will be their mission. There is no say for India with regard to the safety of UN peacekeepers, because these decisions are entirely controlled by the P5 countries, as UN peacekeeping is entirely under the control of the UN Security Council. UNSC, which is one of the primary organs of UN, the most powerful organ of the UN, has complete powers and decision-making authority with regard to peacekeeping missions. This essentially means that the 5 permanent members, the P5 countries of UNSC, which hold the veto power, they get to make decisions on UN peacekeeping missions. They decide where the soldiers will be deployed, what will be their mission, what will be their mandate. The P5 countries essentially decide the safety of UN peacekeepers. But the troop contributing nations like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they have no say, no role in protecting their soldiers once they are deployed on UN peacekeeping missions. This is a big concern we have had from a long time. This concern is increasing day by day for India because recently, as I pointed out, fatalities amongst UN peacekeeping forces is going up. Data from the UN shows that fatality rate is increasing over the last 2-3 years. As of 2020, 13 UN peacekeepers had been killed in action. These were direct attacks. These were deaths which happened due to malicious attacks, not due to illness or accident. These were attacks carried out by the rebels or by the terror groups or by governments itself in the conflict zone. So due to a direct attack, around 13 UN peacekeepers had been killed in total in 2020. This number has almost doubled to 25 last year, and this year already 26 UN peacekeepers have lost their lives. So the number is increasing year on year, and this is what India is concerned about. See, these are some of the important UN peacekeeping missions that are going on currently in South Sudan, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Central African Republic, Mali, Lebanon, Sudan and South Sudan, because both countries are at conflict, in Israel and Syria as well, in Cyprus. In all these countries, hundreds of UN peacekeepers are deployed, especially in African nations like Central African Republic and DRC. The conflict has increased, acts of terrorism, civil war has gone up, and this poses an increasing threat to UN peacekeepers. Just last week, Bangladesh lost a few soldiers in Central African Republic due to a direct attack carried out on UN peacekeepers. Few months back, India lost a couple of BSF Jawans who are deployed on a UN peacekeeping mission in Democratic Republic of Congo. So this is the serious risk that UN peacekeepers are facing, and India is trying to push the UN to ensure that troop contributing countries also have a role to play in determining the deployment and safety of UN peacekeepers. India has recently pointed out that UN peacekeeping missions, they turn out to be entirely different missions on the ground. When UN peacekeepers are deployed in a conflict zone, their mandate is only to maintain peace, to ensure that the ceasefire between two rebel groups or between government and rebel groups is maintained. Basically, it's a non-combat role. It is supposed to be a non-combat role. But once they're deployed on the ground, the situation changes. It essentially becomes a peace enforcing role where they have to actively engage in combat to maintain peace, to maintain stability. Because the conflicting parties are not upholding the ceasefire. They're not maintaining the peace. So peace has to be enforced, thus pushing UN soldiers to engage in active combat. And this is a role that UN peacekeepers are not prepared for. They don't have that kind of military support, the weapons, the intelligence needed to engage in an active combat role. Their primary role is peacekeeping, to keep the peace which has been set up through a ceasefire, not to enforce peace by engaging in combat. So this mismatch between the mandate and the ground reality is posing a big risk for the UN peacekeepers. India has been raising this issue at UN, but the UN is not listening, because these decisions related to peacekeeping missions is entirely controlled by UN Security Council. That's the reason why India has been trying its best to protect UN peacekeepers. Last year, we provided a software called Unite Aware. This is a software developed by India along with UN peacekeeping forces. It's an IT platform, a technology-based platform that provides situational awareness by drawing intelligence assessments from modern surveillance tools. By drawing intelligence from various technological platforms, right, it collates the intelligence and provides threat assessments for the UN peacekeepers who are deployed on the ground. It's a tech-based platform India has created called Unite Aware. So India contributed to the development of this application. We contributed close to $2 million. India built the technology as well, and we have donated this software to the UN peacekeeping forces. Apart from that, we have recently submitted a 10-point formula to address the security and operational challenges being faced by UN peacekeeping forces. After 2 BSF Jawans were killed a couple of months back, India has proposed a 10-point plan through which the safety of UN peacekeepers can be ensured. This includes making the host governments accountable to protect the UN peacekeepers, to ensure their safety. It also includes a provision to hold those who are accountable, to hold those who are responsible for the deaths of UN peacekeepers, to hold them accountable under international law. In case of direct attacks, malicious attacks, India has proposed a plan through which the attacker would be held accountable for the terrorist attack that they would have committed. So they should be tried under international law. So such provisions have been proposed by India as part of this plan, and we continue pushing for UN reforms, broader reforms of the UN itself, so UNSC can be expanded. So countries like India and others can also become permanent members, thereby get a role to decide on the peacekeeping missions of the UN peacekeeping forces. So this is what India is trying to do to ensure the safety of UN peacekeepers. It's in this context that the topic acquires relevance following recent incidents where Indian and Bangladeshi soldiers were killed, and also because of the recent visit of the UN peacekeeping chief to India. So both from a prelims and mains point of view, the topic can be very important. Now moving on to the third topic, we'll talk about the tragedy that happened in Gambia. First, where is Gambia located? Gambia is an African nation located in the Sahara region, in the West African region over here. It's a small West African nation in the Saharan belt. In Gambia, around 70 children have lost their lives following a tragedy, and these deaths have been linked by the WHO to cough syrups, contaminated cough syrups that they had consumed, which were actually produced in India by an Indian pharmaceutical firm. An Indian pharma company called Maiden Pharmaceutical Limited, which is based out of Haryana, produced these cough syrups. They were mainly meant for exports. They are not sold in the domestic market. They were exported from India to Africa because India is a major drug supplier to African nations. You might be aware that India is referred to as the pharmacy of the world. We produce the world's largest number of vaccines. We produce the world's largest amount of generic drugs. And these pharma products we produce, they act as the backbone of Africa's healthcare sector. Across Africa, most countries, they depend on Indian medicines, Indian drugs and Indian vaccines to combat a variety of diseases. So in many ways, India, Africa share a very important, a very close relationship in the healthcare sector. So now this important relationship is at the risk of getting affected, getting compromised because of the incident that has happened in Gambia. The cough syrups produced in India by this company was adulterated with toxic contaminants. This affected the kidney functioning of the children who consumed the cough syrup, thus leading to their deaths. WHO has blacklisted the company, and many countries which also import from this firm have already blacklisted this firm. This company already had a bad remark from other countries. Even in India, many state governments had blacklisted Maiden Pharma. Countries like Vietnam have also placed Maiden Pharma on their blacklist for many years. The same firm has exported cough syrups to Gambia, resulting in this tragedy, and this could threaten India-Africa relations, the trade relations, especially India's supply of drugs, medicines and vaccines to African nations. That's why it's a very, very important development. As you know, Africa is a new geopolitical playground where major powers are competing for influence. The US has always been a dominant power, which is interested in Africa's resources. China has emerged as a key player in Africa, primarily through its Belt and Road Initiative, and it is capitalizing on its investments and gaining influence and gaining hold of resources, key resources in Africa. India is not far behind. India is also catching up with China, competing with all the major powers to ensure that we remain influential in Africa. See, in Africa, we already enjoy historical civilizational links with many African countries. Especially in southern and eastern Africa, India has very close cultural relations from centuries. We are trying to build upon this. We are trying to build stronger political and economic relations, and especially in the sub-Saharan belt, in the Maghreb region, India has already become the second largest trading partner, especially towards West Africa, after China. So across Africa, you see a rising Indian influence, a rising Indian economic influence, along with our diplomatic influence. So this relationship, this trade relationship with African nations is primarily based on the healthcare exports of India, the pharma exports that we carry out, drugs, medicines, and vaccines. Because India exports a lot of generic drugs to these countries. And this has become the backbone of Africa's healthcare sector. Especially if you look at southern African countries like South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, right? Then West African countries like Senegal, Gambia, Burkina Faso and the others. Even East African nations like Mozambique, Tanzania and the others. Even Kenya. They all import Indian pharmaceutical products in large quantities. It's a very big trade relationship that we have, and their healthcare programs are dependent on these Indian drugs. Because see, these regions are affected by a number of diseases, including HIV/AIDS. There are many other diseases prevalent in these regions, and to ensure the healthcare of the people here, the governments are dependent on Indian drugs, Indian vaccines, and Indian medicines. This is a defining aspect of our diplomatic relationship. You can see here in this graph how India exports millions of dollars worth pharma products to different regions of Africa. The top regions are West Africa and Southern Africa. They are the largest importers of Indian pharma products, followed by East Africa, then Central Africa and North Africa. Essentially, many African nations are dependent on India's pharma industry, right? So this important relationship is at the risk of being disrupted because of what has happened in Gambia. That's why it's very important to maintain strict standards and regulations in our pharma industry. This has direct implications for India because India will be blamed for the tragedy. The Indian government will be held accountable eventually. The mistake of one company could cost India an important relationship with African nations. Most countries might become hesitant to continue depending on India, right? Now see, India has already played a very big role in Africa's healthcare sector. You should be aware of this. There could be a potential mains question because of the development asking you to examine India's role in Africa's healthcare sector. This important relationship cannot be disrupted. That's why we have to draw lessons from the tragedy and strengthen our regulations and standards and ensure that the pharma companies are following the right standards. India's CDSCO, the Central Drug Standards Control Organization, has to strictly enforce the drug standards as per the law and ensure that the industry standards, safety requirements are met by the pharma companies. Just look at how African countries have fought against HIV/AIDS. Of late, you see a major decline in the incidence and in the prevalence of HIV/AIDS in African nations. This corresponds with increasing coverage of antiretroviral drugs. And India has been a major supplier of antiretroviral drugs to African nations. Today, if HIV/AIDS is on the decline in Africa, large part of the credit goes to India, goes to Indian pharma companies. Another example would be Africa's fight against meningitis A. Africa successfully eliminated meningitis A with the help of WHO and India. Indian companies like the Serum Institute of India, which also produced Covishield vaccine, introduced a new vaccine for fighting the African strain of meningitis. We produce this in large numbers at very cheap costs, at a very cheap rate. And with these reliable supplies, African nations, they eliminated meningitis in the meningitis belt of Africa. The reason why African nations depend on India is because we produce generic drugs which are not patented. These are available at a fraction of a cost compared to the drugs and vaccines produced by Western companies, because those are patented products. So this is the leverage that India had in Africa, and India continues to play a critical role in Africa's healthcare sector across the industry. When the pandemic broke out, India dispatched medical assistance to more than 25 countries in Africa, free of cost. We supplied essential medical items to help these countries to fight the pandemic. We even conducted a remote training course under our ITEC program. Right? The MEA runs a key training program called Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation. Under the ITEC program, an online program was run by India to train the healthcare workers of African nations so that they are capable enough to fight and deal with the pandemic. We also have the Pan-African E-Network project, which was a brainchild of former President APJ Abdul Kalam. Through the Pan-African E-Network project, we are offering tele-education, telemedicine services through ISRO satellite networks. We have set up satellite receiving terminals across African nations, connected them with schools and hospitals through OFC cables, so that through Indian communication satellites, African schools and hospitals are connected with Indian schools and hospitals. So we are extending remote education, remote healthcare through Pan-African e-network project. Hundreds of Indian doctors and nurses, they work across African countries. They already play a key role in Africa's healthcare sector. Major Indian hospital chains like Apollo hospitals, Agarwal Eye hospitals, they've all expanded their hospital chain network in African nations as well, and they're making big investments. This is mutually beneficial. It provides better healthcare to African nations while building our close diplomatic relations, thus helping India counter the rising Chinese influence. Medical tourism is a big opportunity because every year, thousands of Africans, they come to India for medical treatment. Because in India, they can get high quality medical treatment, especially tertiary care, at a very cheaper cost. So this critical relationship is facing a risk because of the tragedy that has happened in Gambia. Because of the disaster, there will be more scrutiny on India's exports to these countries. The drugs, medicines we export will invite more scrutiny because there are concerns that regulations and standards are not being followed by Indian pharma companies. This could be exploited by developed countries as well, by US and European countries, and even by China, to put more pressure on Africa's dependency on India for drugs, medicines and vaccines. Because developed countries already point out that India does not follow the required sanitary and phytosanitary standards. They keep pushing Indian industry to maintain better hygiene and safety standards. So this could become an opportunity for them as well to put more pressure on India, thus affect our relations with key African nations. If countries back out from importing Indian drugs, Indian medicines, this could deliver a big hit for our economic relationship. So that's the reason why India is acting very quickly. India has opened its own investigation and India is trying to get into the bottom of this tragedy so that we ensure that this doesn't repeat again. That's the reason why the topic is very important, especially for your mains. Next, the last two topics for the day, both are related. There is a small connection here. So let's talk about the Nobel Peace Prize that was announced last week. Let's look at the Nobel Peace laureates. Why have they been chosen by the Nobel Committee? The reason why is important. And then we'll end the discussion by a related topic, a related development that took place last week. See, the Nobel Committee announced all the key Nobel Prizes last week, and one of the important prizes amongst them is the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize recognizes individuals and even organizations who contribute immensely to maintenance of global peace and stability. So both individuals and organizations can be recognized. This time the Nobel Peace Prize has been shared between three entities. The one Nobel laureate is Ales Bialysky, who is a Belarusian human rights advocate. You can see him in the image over here. Apart from this individual, there are two organizations which have been chosen. That is Memorial, which is a Russian human rights organization, and Center for Civil Liberties, which is a Ukrainian human rights organization. There's a specific reason why these three entities have been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. There is something to do with Russia. That's the reason why the Nobel Committee has chosen Ales Bialysky and Memorial and Center for Civil Liberties. Through this, the Nobel Committee is sending out a message to Russia, as Russia has committed a major act of aggression against Ukraine. So let's see why the Nobel Committee has chosen these three entities. While announcing the award, the Nobel Committee stated that the laureates, the three laureates, they represent the civil society in their respective home countries. That is Belarus, Russia, and of course Ukraine. They have for many years promoted the right to criticize power, protect fundamental rights of their citizens, and they have made an outstanding effort to document war crimes and human rights abuses and the abuse of power. Together, they demonstrate the significance of civil society for peace and democracy. The message here is very clear. The message is targeted against Russia, where the Nobel Committee is essentially holding Russia responsible for gross human rights violations, war crimes, abuse of power, and erosion of democracy and fundamental rights in Russia, Ukraine, and also in Belarus. Because Belarus currently is a very close ally of Russia. Ales Bialysky, the Belarusian human rights activist, he is popularly known for fighting for human rights in Belarus, where under authoritarian government which is allied with Russia, democratic rights have been curbed and violated in Belarus. If you just take a look at the profile of this individual, and if you look at the profile of these two organizations from Russia and Ukraine, you'll get to know why the Nobel Committee has chosen them for the Nobel Peace Prize. This is clearly a message, an implicit message being sent out to Russia, that Russia is acting like an aggressor state. It's using military aggression that's leading to war crimes and unnecessary violation of human rights. The Nobel Committee stated that it wishes to honor the outstanding champions of human rights, democracy, and peaceful coexistence in the neighboring countries of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. So this is very clear. The message here is very clear that it's an indirect message being sent out by the Nobel Committee to Russia to stop its atrocities, to stop its violation of human rights. Now look at the profile of Ales Bialysky. This human rights activist from Belarus, he has been leading a fight for human rights and democracy from 1996. Back then, Belarus witnessed a revolution of sorts. There was an uprising that took place called the Minsk Spring that took place in the capital of Belarus, Minsk. This was a pro-democracy movement that started in 96. But this pro-democracy movement was crushed with force, and the current president, Alexander Lukashenko, he has captured power in the country and he is ruling like a dictator. In Belarus, you have an authoritarian government which makes Belarus the last dictatorship of Europe. And Alexander Lukashenko is a very, very close ally and friend of Vladimir Putin. Russia and Belarus are very close allies. In fact, Belarus even supported the Russian invasion of Ukraine and stationed Russian troops in the southern parts of Belarus, through which Russia invaded northern Ukraine. So Belarus has directly assisted Russia in the war efforts. And the Nobel Committee has clearly chosen Ales Bialysky to send out this message to Russia and Belarus. Similarly, Memorial, it's a Russian human rights organization started during the Soviet era. This was during the Cold War period. In 1987, this human rights organization was founded to document the oppression that was being carried out by the communist regime, that is under the Soviet Union. Right? It has played a pivotal role in recording the suffering of the Soviet citizens. It has documented the sufferings of the victims, their families, under the oppressive rule of the Soviet Union, where there were no fundamental rights, no democratic rights. The human rights abuses, war crimes have been documented by the organization, and it continues to fight for human rights and takes a stand against political repression in modern Russia as well. So that's the reason why Memorial has also been chosen by the Nobel Committee. Next is the Center for Civil Liberties, which is a Ukrainian human rights organization set up in 2007. This organization has been fighting for democracy in Ukraine. It's pushing Ukraine towards democracy, to push Ukraine away from Russian influence. And especially after Russia annexed Crimea, after it sponsored an insurgency in eastern Ukraine, and now after Russia invaded the country, this human rights organization has been documenting Russia's war crimes and atrocities that have been committed. It is building a database of all the violations that Russia has committed in the last 8 years in Ukraine. So clearly the Nobel Committee has specifically chosen this individual and these two organizations to send out an implicit message, an indirect message to Russia, that Russia today has become an aggressor state. It has violated human rights and it's being accused of committing war crimes. This potentially could be a Western tactic to put pressure on Russia, to further put pressure on Russia, because the Nobel Committee, especially the Nobel Peace Prize, is often placed under a lot of controversy. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the Nobel Peace Laureates, because quite often Western countries have a defining role to play in selecting the Nobel Peace Laureates. So it's in this context that you should be aware of this year's awardees and their links with Russia. Now, coming to a related development and the last topic for the day, there was a major turn in the Russia-Ukraine war. Last week, a major attack took place on a strategic bridge that you can see here in the image. This bridge that you see here, it's a critical link between the Crimean Peninsula and Russia. Is that clear? It's a critical link between the Crimean Peninsula and Russia, which was crucial for Russia to send supplies to the Crimean Peninsula. This bridge was blown apart through an explosion. Reportedly, the explosion has been carried out by a truck bomb, by using a truck bomb. So experts believe that the attack might have been engineered by Ukrainian intelligence services, because Crimea, which you see here in the map, the Crimean Peninsula, it was annexed by Russia in 2014. Then Russia built this strategic bridge, which you saw in the image, across the Kerch Strait. It's also called the Kerch Strait Bridge, right? The bridge includes a roadway and a rail line as well. And it was critical for sending supplies from mainland Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. In the Crimean Peninsula, after Russia captured it, Russia has strengthened its military presence here, especially its naval presence. There's a major naval port, a naval base of Russia as well. And from Crimean Peninsula, Russia has been staging attacks against Ukraine, especially against southern Ukraine. Ever since the war began, Crimean Peninsula has been a staging ground for the war. So Ukraine, southern part of Ukraine has been under attack. The cities of Zaporizhia, important port cities of Mariupol, they've largely been brought under attack from Russia by using the Crimean Peninsula as a staging ground, as a base. So this bridge was critical for Russia to send supplies, military supplies and civilian supplies, to keep its military positions active and well supplied, because Crimean Peninsula has been critical in the Russian war against Ukraine. This strategic bridge that was connecting Russia and Crimean Peninsula has been blown apart, and a part of the bridge has even collapsed, as you can see here. It has not completely disrupted the supplies, but partially the supplies have been disrupted because of this major attack. As you can see, a part of the bridge, a roadway, collapsed entirely. The railway line, however, is still fine as it still stands, but the attack was timed perfectly to coincide with a train that was passing through carrying oil on the railway line. So this increased the intensity of the explosion, and it was such a major attack that Russian president reacted immediately, and Vladimir Putin called it a terrorist attack. Many Ukrainians have celebrated the attack, but officially Ukrainian government hasn't claimed the attack. So experts believe that the attack might have been planned as a covert operation by Ukrainian intelligence services as a retaliation against Russia, because cutting off this key supply line will affect Russia's ability to launch attacks from the Crimean Peninsula. Now this comes at a critical juncture in the war, because in the last 2 months, Russia has been facing a lot of resistance from Ukraine. Russia has faced battlefield defeats in eastern Ukraine. Russia has been pushed back. Ukraine took complete control of key cities like Kiev, then Kharkiv and others. So as Russia is being put on the back foot, and as Ukrainian counterattacks have increased, it comes at a critical point where Ukraine has retaliated in a big way potentially, and Russia obviously feels humiliated following this attack. That's the reason why Russia retaliated with brutal force. It has used disproportionate force immediately, and it has retaliated with airstrikes and missile strikes across Ukrainian cities. According to reports, more than 75 cruise missiles have been launched by Russia at key Ukrainian cities, including the capital Kiev. Civilian buildings and settlements have been targeted, and a number of people have been killed and injured. So this marks a serious escalation in the conflict, and it has invited an immediate response from India as well. India has stated that India is deeply concerned at the recent escalation in the conflict, where civilians and infrastructure is being targeted. So this is a very strong opinion expressed by India, because recently Prime Minister Modi, he had met with Putin at the SCO summit, and he had called upon Putin to end the war in Ukraine. Prime Minister Modi had pointed out that this is no time for war when the global economy is facing a major crisis. So this makes India's position very important, very clear as well, that India is not comfortable with the escalation that Russia has carried out. Is that clear? So that is why the explosion of this strategic bridge, the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea, is a key milestone in the war. It marks a pushback against Russia by Ukraine. And Russia's retaliation has been disproportionate as expected. It has rained missiles on Ukrainian cities and marks a major escalation in the conflict. So it's important to keep track of these key developments in the Russia-Ukraine war, as it directly affects India's interests. So on this note, I would like to bring this week's discussion to an end. We have covered 5 important topics, and I hope it was a fruitful discussion. So do let me know how the session went by sharing your comments below. Don't forget to press the like button, and do share the video with other aspirants, and do subscribe to our channel. So that is it from me. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week, that is next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Good night.